Is from Exodus 17, 1 through 7. All the congregation of the people of Israel moved on from the wilderness of Sin by stages, according to the commandment of the Lord, and camped at Rephidim. But there was no water for the people to drink. Therefore the people found fault with Moses and said, "Give us water to drink." And Moses said to them, "Why do you find fault with me? Why do you put the Lord to the proof?" But the people thirsted there for water, and the people murmured against Moses and said, "Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our cattle with thirst?" So Moses cried to the Lord, "What shall I do with this people? They are almost ready to stone me." And the Lord said to Moses, "Pass on before the people, taking with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the rod with which you struck the Nile, and go. Behold, I will stand before you there on the rock at Horeb, and you shall strike the rock, and the water shall come out of it, that the people may drink." And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. And he called the name of the place Massah and Meribah, because of the fault-finding of the children of Israel, and because they put the Lord to the proof by saying, "Is the Lord among us or not?" Let's see, the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
So, we've got a bunch of Israelites wandering in the desert, stepping out on faith that their bondage lies behind them and that the promised land lies before them, not knowing, though, for sure where they're going, but landing in this place called Rephidim, knowing that there isn't any water to drink. And it doesn't take a rocket scientist to know that when you're making your way through the desert, you can't stop too long in places without water, especially when you have an entire nation of people making the trip alongside you. And sure enough, it didn't take long for them to break into a round of that ancient pastime, "Let's complain about our leadership." Come to think of it, we Christians have probably inherited that pastime too, I suspect. "Moses, what about the water? Moses, what are we going to drink? Moses, at least in Egypt we knew we weren't going to die." If you think about it, this is essentially the history of the Exodus. Moses and the people flee from Egypt. Pharaoh's army is defeated. They enter the desert. They complain. They continue through the desert. They complain some more. Repeat that previous step for another 40 years. Moses finally dies from all the complaining, and then Joshua leads them into the promised land. Okay, so we know that Moses didn't really die from the complaining, but you can bet there were days when he surely must have wanted to. However, if this story is starting to sound or even feel a little bit familiar, then perhaps it's because as a nation, we could almost put ourselves into this story over, well, let's call it the past 10 years. We begin to feel some of the stresses in our social and our political life, and so we elected a charismatic leader in Barack Obama who promised change. And then we complained. And just a few months ago, we elected another charismatic leader in Donald Trump who promised change. And you guessed it, we're complaining again. And you know what? It wasn't just this right-left political divide over these past 10 years either. When Obama was president, the right complained, the left complained, and we looked out across the metaphorical desert of our nation and our national landscape and we wondered, where's the promised land? Now that Trump is president, the left is complaining, the right is complaining, and we're squinting out toward the horizon and wondering, where is that promised land? And we know things are tough, And we knew things were tough. And none of us expected this to change overnight when either of these guys were elected. But this week, as a nation, I think we find ourselves once again pitching our tents in Rephidim all over again. And now that we've ended the election and packed away our traveling gear, we're starting to look for water. And there appears to be no well in sight. At least that's the message we got this week with President Trump's first annual budget proposal. Cuts, cuts, and more cuts. Now, we're going to get to the rock here in a minute, but I think this past week you'd literally have to have been living under that rock to have not heard something about this. There's been an absolute storm in the media over White House Budget Chief Mick Mulvaney apparently justifying cuts to programs like Meals on Wheels and the free and reduced school lunch program because they are, and I quote, just not showing results. Trust me, you cannot have access to the internet and not know that quote by heart after this past week. I mean, the outcry following this press conference has been so strong that even members of Congress from the president's own party are backing away from his proposal and rightly reminding us that ultimately it's their job as Congress to write the national budget. The president just gets to present his ideas. And that's where this mess is ultimately headed, isn't it? We might as well go ahead and change the name of the country to Massah and Meribah, because we're about to start quarreling and testing each other like you would not believe. And the sad truth of the matter is that this is the tone that was set during the exchanges between Mulvaney and the press during that conference, and in a way this was the tone set by Mulvaney himself based on his own statements. But I'm not talking about this brouhaha surrounding the idea that he said we have to cut school lunches for impoverished kids because the program is just not showing results. In fairness, that isn't actually what he said. His complaint was that it's actually too hard to come up with measurable results for a program which provides funds to individual states known as community development block grants, and that in the absence of meaningful metrics by which to measure these block grant programs, Mulvaney insisted that that inability to measure gives us a justification for not keeping them. And to be fair here too, I remember hearing this exact same debate raging some 15 years ago as an undergraduate in a political science class. Do block grants, do the states really do any good, or are we just throwing around a lot of money? So that complaint in itself isn't new either. But on the other hand, to be fair to Mulvaney's critics, it's also not entirely clear that he wasn't indirectly implying that Meals on Wheels or the school lunch program weren't showing results either. But the problem that we face ultimately runs deeper than whether we argue about the effectiveness of certain programs or the various means by which we distribute funds from the federal government to the states to be used to fund said programs. Because the divisions that scar us as a people run much deeper. We've become polarized so hard to the left and to the right, and in such great numbers, that it's difficult to imagine a way forward when a quarter of the country is liberal, a quarter of the country is conservative, and the rest of the country doesn't vote. I can wait if any of y'all want to laugh. But admittedly and assuredly, there is no hope for moving out of Massah and Meribah when those who are leading us are conspiring so diligently and effectively to keep us divided one against another, rather than uniting us toward a common goal and a hope for a solution. And Mr. Mulvaney spoke directly to this in that same press conference. When challenged on his assertion that this budget proposal was trying to do the compassionate thing, Mulvaney immediately moved to divide us in his response. And he said, "Now you're only focusing on half the equation, right? You're focusing on the recipients of the money. We're focusing on the recipients of the money and the people who give us the money in the first place. I think it's fairly compassionate to go to them and say, look, we're not going to ask you for your hard-earned money anymore. Single mom of 2 in Detroit? Okay, give us your money. We're not going to do that anymore unless we can guarantee that money will be used in a proper function. That is about as compassionate as you can get. Those were Mulvaney's words in answering that challenge about a compassionate budget. But what we get from that quote is that we are playing a zero-sum game, that we live in an economic of scarcity that says we have to pit single moms of two from Detroit against grandparents receiving Meals on Wheels and underprivileged kids receiving free or reduced school lunches. What it says is that it's me against you, against him, against them. But don't worry, the president is on our side. Well, our sides, individually speaking, of course. But the thing we know about desert journeys is that we don't all pull together, we will assuredly die separately. That's the very core of the hospitality code of the ancient biblical world. Travelers rely on the hospitality of strangers to make their trips across the desert because they would assuredly run out of water or die of exposure or become lost in unfamiliar terrain. The list of terrible ways to die in the desert just goes on and on. And so too does the list of terrible ways in which we will continue to experience death so long as we embrace the politics of division and scarcity. From children becoming stunted in their physical, mental, and emotional growth due to a lack of nutritious food, to seniors losing those important moments of social contact with a world that they might otherwise experience only through a television screen were it not for those meal deliveries, and so many more. In too many ways, we face the same challenges as the Israelites who fled into the wilderness to escape bondage, hoping and praying that there truly was a promised land awaiting them. There were too many of them to rely on the hospitality of random well-meaning strangers along the way, and like them, our needs as a society are too great to hope that our churches and our charities and our nonprofits alone can ensure the survival of all of our people. Like the Israelites in the desert, we too believe that we are journeying toward becoming a land of promise. Yet, unlike our president, who thinks that this nation was once great and we've somehow overshot the mark and now need to backtrack our way to greatness again, I believe that the greatness of America lies not behind us, nor even before us, but lies within us. What makes our country great is that we, the people, have the ability to continue that 240, almost 241-year project of struggling to make our union more perfect. That we wrestle with what it means to establish justice. That we adapt to a changing world to ensure domestic tranquility and provide a common defense. And that we keep our eyes on the prize of promoting a general welfare, not just for some, but for all. But our future, like the Israelites, depends on what we choose to do next. We have pitched our tents here at Rephidim, and we have begun to quarrel. We have looked to our Moses, and he has said that we're going to have to ration the water. We have looked to our tribal elders in Congress, and they're saying, well, it's not quite that bad, but somebody is probably going to have to drink less. But maybe it's time to look to God and see what heaven's economic order on earth might look like. That is, after all, what we're praying each week, are we not? Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. I won't pretend I can flesh out for you in a single sermon, much less in the time that I have left here this morning. So I won't pretend that I can quickly explain the calculus of the divine, in which there are no zero-sum equations that force single moms in Detroit to square off against struggling coal miners in Pennsylvania, who in turn have to steal the food out of the mouths of hungry children down the street, who already depend on the Bremerton Backpack Brigade to get them through the weekend. But I won't lie and tell you that I didn't try. The first idea of this sermon wasn't even about this topic, didn't even touch on the budget. You can blame the other Washington for messing me up on that one. But then the first written draft of this sermon, well, I was angry. I was really angry. And even if I hadn't told you last week that sermon was about as close as I get to being a firebrand, I knew that draft number 1 that I was preparing this week was not the message that I was called here to deliver. But even after writing a second draft, admittedly, I was still seething, just more quietly. So you can thank Yuki for talking me down. And she was right, because I wasn't trying to proclaim the vision of God in that message either. The gospel call to embrace creation as a source of God's abundant provision and to share it as graciously as it has been given. It took some serious prayer, and it took some serious talking to. And it took a lot more time than I wanted to spend on the sermon this week. But admittedly, I'm closer to the gospel vision now than when I started. And that's how I pulled myself away from Massah and Meribah and started moving forward again toward God's promise. And we can too. Oh, I'm not saying it won't happen without us changing our plans. I'm not even saying it won't make us angry before it makes us hopeful. But God is still calling, and abundance, possibility, and grace are available all around us. So let's find our place in this national hunt for water and see if there isn't some rock that we can't bust open somewhere. Because whatever our leaders are telling us, and whatever we might even be telling ourselves, God is very clearly saying that there is enough. You know, when I started rewriting this sermon, I didn't ever imagine that I'd make it back to the title I chose earlier this week, but here we are. Caught between a rock and a hard place. Choose the rock and keep moving forward. Keep moving forward. Amen.